In the RC world, are you worried by the words, troubled by the terms, or very confused by the vernacular? Today we're going to talk about some of these terms, and maybe, just maybe, you can help us out. So if you are not new to RC and you had some certain terms that really confused you when you started out, post them down below and let people know what those terms are, because it can probably help somebody out. But for those of you who are new, what we're going to do is talk about the new terms that you're going to come across that you probably haven't heard anywhere else, and this will help you understand what they are. At least I hope so. So let's start out on our list. Some parts of an RC crawler. I'm going to talk about mostly RC crawlers today. The diff or pumpkin is something that you're going to hear quite often, and this is short for differential, or the pumpkin of the axle. So the differential is housed inside the pumpkin, would be one way to say it, but it is this center section right here, and we're looking at an element enduro axle. So the pumpkin is part of the axle, and it's where the differential hides, and sometimes we call that a diff. Moving on to another term, tranny. You will hear tranny used a lot, and we're not talking about your mom. We're talking about the transmission in the center of the rig. Typically, it's in the center of the rig. Sometimes it's forward, and sometimes it's in the center. But it is this center block that the motor bolts to, and then that shoves powers out to our axles into the diff, actually. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is the tire and or rim size. So here's our tires and rims, and you'll hear people talking about them like a 1.0 or a 1.9 or a 2.2 or 3.0 or whatever. And what that actually is indicating is the size of the rim and the size of the bead of the tire that sits into the rim. So a 1.9 is 1.9 inches, 2.2 is 2.2 inches, and etc., etc. A 1.0 wheel is smaller than a 2.2 wheel. So that's what that means. The next one, dig. This one can actually mean a few different things, but typically what we're talking about is when your front tires are spinning faster than the rear. You could have a dig tranny where it completely locks out your rear axle and your front is only moving by itself. Or the way that I used to understand it was you also can have a dig ratio. And this is essentially the ratio between the front and the rear. In a percentage, it could be, or in ratio, how much faster does your front turn than your rear? We call that dig ratio, and some people now call it overdrive. You may have heard of that as well. The next one we're going to talk about is the remote control. I always call it a remote control. Technically, it's a radio control, but there are two parts to a remote system or a radio system. And that is the RX and the TX. RX stands for receiver and TX stands for transmitter. So on this rig we have our RX, our receiver, right here, and that gets the signal from the transmitter, which is hiding around here somewhere. I can just grab a random transmitter. Here's our TX, T for transmit, R for receive. That is the radio system. The next one on the list, it is the servo. The servo is what makes your rig steer. It is this purple thing that is mounted up front. On a crawler, you can either have them mounted on the axle or mounted on the chassis. The chassis mounted ones are called chassis mounted servos, and the ones that are on the axle are called axle mounted servos. And sometimes you'll see that abbreviated, but that is what the servo is and what it does. It is your steering. If this was a gasoline or a nitro-powered radio control vehicle, you could also have servos that actuate your brakes and your throttle as well. But for electrics, you pretty much only have this for steering duty, and sometimes they will actuate a second speed or your dig as well. So that's what the servo does. The next thing on our list is the ESC, electronic speed control. This may have multiple names, so put it down in the comments if you know it as something else, but the nomenclature that I usually use is ESC. The ESC is what controls our motor. So the ESC is wrapped inside this little brick right here. I even have one probably in here that I could share. There we go. They can sometimes be little chips like this, and sometimes they are built into a case which looks like more of a brick, and even in some cases they can be built inside the motor itself, which is kind of new to the market, and usually we call those 2-in-1s or something to that effect. So ESC, electronic speed control, controls your motor. The next one on the list is motor terms that will be very handy for you. So we have turns and or kV. Brushless motors like this are usually listed in kV. The kV actually stands for voltage constant, spelled in German, which is why it's kV. I won't go into too many details about that. However, the other way to think about kV is simply the RPM per volt. So something that has a kV of 1000 will spend 1000 RPMs per volt that you apply. You apply 10,000, or 10, boy, that'd be fast. If you apply 10 volts to a 1000 kV motor, it's going to spend 10,000 RPM. Turns is how a brushed motor is usually described, and this is the actual wraps of wire on the motor itself. So a 15-turn motor has 15 wraps of wire, and a 30-turn motor would have 30 wraps of wire. Now, there is some kV equivalents. A 55-turn motor is about like 1000 kV. A 21-turn motor is about, it's like 2700 kV or thereabouts if we're talking about 550s at least. And you can at least compare them knowing that a higher turn motor is slower than a lower turn motor, just as a lower kV motor is slower than a higher kV motor. We could almost have a full video just describing that, but on the basics, turns and or kV is what describes the speed of a motor. Next up, BEC. BEC stands for battery eliminating circuitry. These days, we're not eliminating any batteries using a BEC, but the name has stuck. One way to think about it is that the BEC is just another voltage regulator. So a lot of times you'll have your ESC and it won't have enough power for your servo. So what you do is you add an aftermarket BEC. The Castle BEC is extremely ubiquitous in this industry, and that BEC will supply power to your servo. And this can be directly, this can be indirectly, it can be plugged in through your RX. There's a lot of different ways that you can power it, but long story short, the BEC is literally just a voltage regulator that makes sure that you have a constant voltage going to certain devices in your system. Very handy sometimes. All right, battery types. You will see these listed usually as LiPo or NIMH, nickel metal hydride. And then LiPo stands for lithium polymer. These days, most batteries are going to be lithium on the market. However, you may get a rig that comes stock with a nickel metal hydride, NIMH. And it's good to at least know the differences. Lithium polymer is much more energy dense. It has a lower resistance. It will provide more amperage with less voltage sag. So in general, LiPo is always going to be a superior product. However, you should know sometimes you get a nickel metal hydride with your ready to run rigs. Now, when we're talking about LiPo, we can talk about S and C. S is the number of cells in series, and C is the discharge rate, or sometimes charge rate. So the S, usually 2S, 3S, or 4S in the crawler industry, with 3S being the most popular. Yes, that's 3. It's going to be about 11.1 volts. So 3S is going to be typically what you're going to see. Now, the C rate is the discharge rate, and we could really have a whole video on this, and we have done this before, but typically the higher the C rate, the more discharge you're going to get from the battery, and sometimes the higher quality of the battery as well. Not always. But for crawling at least, the C rate isn't so important. So even a 20 C pack would be enough. So if we were just talking about generally what you're going to find in the crawling market, it's going to be a 3S pack that has a 25C to 35C discharge rating on it. So those are all just really basic terms. If you have more terms that you would like to add, put them down below and let people know what those mean. Maybe if there's terms that confused you when you were a newbie, put those down below as well and help people out. So maybe they'll be able to see it and not have to get on a forum, which maybe forums even aren't a thing by the time this video is released. We're all on Facebook. I won't kid anybody here. So that is the video about our basic terms and vernacular. Does anybody even know what vernacular means these days? As always, thanks for tuning in. Have a great day.